At the United Nations headquarters in New York, the spotlight once again turned to US President Donald Trump. Returning to the General Assembly stage, Trump wasted no time launching a barrage of criticism against the very institution he was addressing. He began by hammering Europe for what he called embarrassing hypocrisy, buying oil and gas from Russia while simultaneously condemning Moscow's war in Ukraine. Trump warned that unless Europe immediately stopped purchasing Russian energy, the entire diplomatic effort against Moscow was nothing more than, in his words, a waste of time. His tone was uncompromising, not a plea, but an ultimatum, and one that left little doubt about his position. From there, he turned to the issue of immigration, a theme familiar to both domestic and international audiences. With his characteristic bluntness, Trump declared that it was time to end the failed experiment of open borders. He told assembled leaders that their countries were, in his words, going to hell because of uncontrolled migration. It was a message that resonated with nationalist movements across the globe, but also provoked deep unease among European allies who saw the remarks as both alarmist and divisive. Only minutes earlier, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva had delivered a very different kind of warning. Speaking in Portuguese, Lula cautioned that anti-democratic forces were threatening institutions worldwide, seeking to subjugate freedoms and weaken the rule of law. His statement reflected Brazil's own struggles with political instability and seemed a pointed response to Washington's tariffs and sanctions. The contrast was striking. While Lula emphasized global cooperation and the defense of democracy, Trump sharpened his focus on confrontation, blaming the UN and its members for what he viewed as systemic failures. Trump then shifted into one of his most memorable riffs of the day, claiming credit for ending 7 wars through direct personal diplomacy, while mocking the UN for not helping in any of them. In dramatic fashion, he recalled that the only things he had received from the UN were, as he put it, a broken escalator that nearly caused an accident for First Lady Melania and a teleprompter that refused to function. The anecdote, delivered with a mix of humour and derision, sparked laughter among some, but exasperation among others. For Trump, it was more than a joke. It was a symbolic condemnation of an institution he considered ineffective, out of touch, and incapable of solving the world's most pressing conflicts. The American president then pivoted sharply to the Middle East. With intensity in his voice, he told the chamber that the recognition of Palestine by key US allies, including the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Australia, was nothing less than a reward for Hamas. He referenced the October 7th attacks, insisting that granting statehood recognition to the Palestinians at this moment was a dangerous act that legitimized terrorism. For Trump, the timing was unconscionable. Hostages remained captive, ceasefire talks were stalled, and violence persisted. His comments placed him in direct opposition not only to much of Europe, but also to a growing bloc of nations pushing for Palestinian recognition as a step toward lasting peace. The room grew tenser as Trump circled back to his core theme, energy and Europe's relationship with Russia. Once again, he repeated his demand that European nations stop importing Russian oil and gas. Repetition has long been one of Trump's rhetorical strategies, using the same words again and again to make them stick in the public consciousness. In this case, the message was unmistakable. According to Trump, Europe was fueling the very war it claimed to oppose. To continue those purchases was, in his telling, nothing short of self-defeating. But perhaps the most controversial moment came near the end of his remarks. Trump declared that climate change was, in his words, the biggest scam ever perpetrated on the world. He dismissed the concept of a carbon footprint as a hoax created by people with, as he put it, bad intentions. For environmental advocates and many world leaders, this was a shocking dismissal of decades of scientific consensus. For Trump's political base, however, it was a reaffirmation of his rejection of international climate agreements and his embrace of economic nationalism. This speech was not just about policy, it was about showmanship. Trump leaned heavily into mockery, grievance, and repetition, crafting a performance designed as much for his domestic audience as for the diplomats sitting in the chamber. Cutaway shots captured leaders' reactions, some silent, some visibly disapproving, and a few nodding in agreement. French President Emmanuel Macron, whose country had just recognized Palestine, entered the hall during Trump's most pointed attacks, a visual reminder of the divisions within the Western alliance. Beyond the theatrics, Trump also used the stage to announce an important diplomatic move, a meeting with Brazilian President Lula next week. This bilateral, he suggested, would focus on the sanctions Washington had imposed on Brazil, many of them tied to the legal troubles of former President Jair Bolsonaro. Analysts quickly noted the stakes. For Trump, repairing relations with Brazil could expand his influence in Latin America. For Lula, it was an opportunity to assert Brazil's independence and push back against what he views as unfair treatment by Washington. The broader context of the UN General Assembly in 2025 only magnified the weight of these clashes. The global stage was already fractured. Debates over the war in Ukraine, divisions over how to handle China's rise, the Middle East in crisis, and growing warnings about democratic backsliding. Trump's confrontational speech did not heal these divides. Instead, it exposed them more starkly. Critics argued that his claim of ending 7 wars was exaggerated at best, misleading at worst. Fact-checkers noted that many of the conflicts he referenced had wound down through multilateral negotiations or local ceasefires, not unilateral deals made by Trump alone. Yet the narrative fit his long-standing image as a deal-maker who operated outside traditional channels. By framing himself as the one who resolved wars while the UN sat idly by, Trump reinforced his central theme: that global institutions were obsolete and that strong direct leadership was the only path forward. His attack on Europe's immigration policies was equally polarizing. Nationalist parties in countries like Italy, Hungary and Poland echoed his sentiments. But for leaders in Berlin, Paris and Brussels, the comments risked inflaming already difficult debates over asylum and migration. By declaring that open borders were sending countries to hell, Trump was not only condemning policy, but also painting a dire picture of Europe's future, one that many saw as overly simplistic and deeply inflammatory. On the issue of Palestine, Trump's words drew sharp responses outside the chamber. Pro-Palestinian groups decried his framing as dismissive of legitimate aspirations for statehood, while Israeli officials praised his steadfast support. The timing was particularly sensitive. Western recognition of Palestine was meant as a symbolic push for peace. Yet Trump portrayed it as the opposite, a dangerous reward for terrorism. His phrasing, we can't forget October 7th, can we, was a deliberate attempt to anchor the debate in the memory of violence, not the possibility of reconciliation. And then there was climate change. Trump's outright dismissal of the crisis stood in stark contrast to speeches delivered by European leaders, many of whom emphasized urgent collective action. For nations already experiencing rising seas, record heat waves and destructive storms, Trump's words were not only out of step with science, but also an insult to their lived reality. Environmental groups warned that such rhetoric undermined global cooperation at a moment when time was running out. Yet for Trump's supporters, this speech checked every box. It reinforced his image as an outsider, unafraid to ridicule powerful institutions. It emphasized America's strength, contrasted against what he framed as Europe's weakness, and it positioned him as a champion of nationalism over multilateralism, rejecting the very foundation of the United Nations. The reactions were as divided as the speech itself. Some leaders applauded certain points, particularly his calls for stronger resistance against Russia. Others remained silent or left the hall. The media quickly seized on the escalator anecdote, replaying it on loop, while analysts debated the substance or lack thereof behind the theatrical delivery. Ultimately, this was not a speech designed to unite or to heal. It was a performance crafted to dominate headlines, to reinforce political narratives back home, and to leave an indelible mark on the 2025 General Assembly. Whether one saw it as bravado, recklessness, or strength, there was no denying that Donald Trump had once again seized the stage and forced the world to respond on his terms. As the session concluded, the contrast between Trump and Lula lingered. One leader calling for an end to open borders and climate action, the other warning of threats to democracy and urging collective defense of institutions. Between them lay the fault lines of a fractured international order, and at the center of it all, under the lights of the UN chamber, Donald Trump reminded the world that he remains a figure who thrives not in consensus but in confrontation.